The needle paused mid-stitch when Beatrice Nolan heard the creak of the old barn door, and she looked up to find a dust-covered cowboy standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, his dark eyes fixed on the ivory silk spread across her lap, like it held all the secrets of her solitary heart. She had come to Ventura, California, in the spring of 1883, with nothing but a trunk of fabric, her mother's sewing kit, and a stubborn determination to build a life on her own terms. The little ranch house she rented sat on the outskirts of town, close enough to civilization that she could walk to the general store, but far enough that the neighbors did not pry too deeply into why a 23-year-old woman lived alone without family or prospects. The barn had become her workshop, where she took in sewing jobs from the townswomen who needed their Sunday dresses mended or their husbands' shirts patched. It was honest work that kept her fed and housed, and she asked for nothing more. But the wedding dress was different. The wedding dress was hers. "I am sorry to intrude, miss," the cowboy said, his voice low and careful, like he was gentling a spooked horse. "I saw smoke from your chimney and thought someone might be home. My horse threw a shoe about 2 miles back, and I was hoping I might borrow some tools to fix it." Beatrice set down her needle and stood, smoothing the silk carefully before draping it over the back of her chair. The cowboy was tall and broad-shouldered, probably around 27 or 28, with sun-darkened skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. Dust covered his clothes and boots, and she could see the weariness in the set of his shoulders. "The toolbox is on the shelf by the door," she said, gesturing behind him. "You are welcome to use whatever you need." He nodded his thanks, but his eyes drifted back to the dress, a question forming on his face that he seemed too polite to ask. She felt heat rise in her cheeks and turned away, busying herself with tidying the spools of thread scattered across her work table. "That is a mighty fine dress," he said finally. "Someone getting married?" "Yes," Beatrice replied, keeping her back to him as she organized the thread by color. "Someone is." She heard him move toward the toolbox, the clink of metal as he sorted through the contents. She thought that would be the end of it, that he would take what he needed and leave her to her work and her strange, solitary dreams. But when she turned around, he was still standing there, the tools forgotten in his hands, looking at her with an expression she could not quite read. "Are you sewing your own wedding dress?" he asked, and there was no judgment in his voice, only curiosity tinged with something that might have been sadness. Beatrice lifted her chin. She had learned long ago not to apologize for the choices she made or the life she built. "I am." "Do you have a groom?" "Not yet." The cowboy was quiet for a long moment, and Beatrice braced herself for the laughter or the pity that usually followed such an admission. But when he spoke again, his voice was serious and steady. "I know a groom who would be honored." The words hung in the air between them, like a promise or a prayer. Beatrice felt her heart skip and stumble in her chest. She studied his face, looking for the joke or the cruelty, but found only earnest honesty in his dark eyes. "You do not know me," she said carefully. "No, madam, I do not," he agreed. "But I know that any woman brave enough to sew her own wedding dress and wait for the right man instead of settling for the wrong one is someone worth knowing. And I know that I have been riding from ranch to ranch for the past 5 years, looking for a place that feels like home, and this is the first time I have walked through a door and felt like I might have found it." Beatrice had imagined this moment 1,000 times in 1,000 different ways. She had imagined meeting someone at a church social or a town dance, imagined a slow and proper courtship with Sunday walks and carefully chaperoned conversations. She had never imagined this. A dust-covered stranger in her barn making an offer that should have sounded like madness, but instead sounded like the answer to every secret wish she had whispered into the darkness. "I do not even know your name," she said, and her voice came out softer than she intended. "Jackson Zimmerman," he said, and he took a step closer, his hat still clutched in his hands. "My friends call me Jack. I have been working cattle drives up and down California for the past few years, but I have saved enough money to buy a small spread of my own. I am a hard worker, I do not drink to excess, and I have never raised my hand to a woman or child. I cannot promise you riches or an easy life, but I can promise you honesty and respect, and a home where you will be valued and cherished." Beatrice pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her heart hammer beneath her palm. Every practical bone in her body told her this was foolishness, that she should send him on his way and forget this strange encounter ever happened. But there was something about the way he looked at her, something about the quiet certainty in his voice, that made her want to take the leap. "My name is Beatrice Nolan," she said. "I came to California from St. Louis 3 years ago after my parents died. I make my living as a seamstress, and I have been sewing this dress for 6 months, adding to it a little bit each week as I could afford the fabric. I have been waiting for someone who sees me as a partner, not a possession, someone who understands that I have a mind and a will of my own." "That sounds like exactly the kind of woman I have been looking for," Jackson said, and there was a smile in his voice now, warm and genuine. "You should know that I am particular about how I keep house," Beatrice continued, feeling reckless and brave and terrified all at once. "I do not cook elaborate meals, and I will expect any husband of mine to do his share of the work. I also intend to keep taking in sewing because I like having my own money and my own independence." "That seems more than fair," Jackson said. "I should tell you that I snore sometimes, and I am not much for fancy words or poetry. But I will work hard to provide for our household, and I will never ask you to be anything other than who you are." They stood there in the barn with dust motes dancing in the afternoon light, two strangers negotiating the terms of a life together with a directness that would have scandalized the proper ladies in town. But there was something honest and clean about it, something that felt right in a way Beatrice had never experienced before. "I think," she said slowly, "that we should spend some time getting to know each other before we make any permanent decisions. You could stay for supper tonight, and we could talk more." "I would like that very much," Jackson said. He went outside to tend to his horse, and Beatrice carefully folded the wedding dress and put it away in her trunk. Her hands were shaking slightly as she started a fire in the stove and began preparing a simple meal of beans and cornbread. She kept glancing out the window at Jackson as he worked on his horse's shoe, his movements efficient and sure. There was something calming about watching him work, something that settled the nervous flutter in her stomach. When he came back inside, he had washed the dust from his face and hands at the pump outside. His hair was damp and slicked back, and Beatrice found herself noticing details she had missed before: the strong line of his jaw, the calluses on his hands that spoke of hard work, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. They sat at her small table and ate, and the conversation came easier than Beatrice had expected. Jackson told her about growing up on a small farm in Kansas, about how his parents had died in a fever epidemic when he was 19, leaving him and his younger sister alone. He had worked odd jobs for a few years to keep them fed until his sister married a good man who could provide for her. Then Jackson had headed west, looking for new opportunities and a fresh start. "I worked on a cattle ranch near Sacramento for 2 years, he said, sopping up the last of his beans with a piece of cornbread. "Saved every penny I could. Then I heard about a small property for sale near Ventura, about 40 acres with good grazing land and a creek that runs year-round. I came down here 3 weeks ago to look at it, and I bought it on the spot. I have been camping out there while I work on fixing up the old cabin." 40 acres is a good size," Beatrice said. "What do you plan to run on it?" "Cattle mostly, maybe some horses. I am not looking to build an empire, just a sustainable operation that can support a family." He paused, his eyes meeting hers across the table. "I know this is all happening fast, Beatrice. If you need time to think about it, I understand. I can come back in a few weeks, or we can write letters while you make up your mind." Beatrice considered this. The practical part of her brain insisted that she needed more time, that she should be cautious and careful. But another part of her, the part that had spent 6 months sewing a wedding dress for a groom who existed only in her imagination, recognized something true and real in Jackson Zimmerman. "Tell me about the cabin," she said, instead of answering directly. "What kind of condition is it in?" Jackson's face lit up as he described the property, and Beatrice found herself smiling at his enthusiasm. The cabin needed work, he admitted, but the bones were good. The roof needed patching, and the windows needed replacing, but the stone fireplace was solid and the foundation was sound. There was a small barn that could house a few animals, and enough flat land near the cabin for a vegetable garden. "I have been working on it every day," he said, replacing the worst of the floorboards, chinking the gaps in the walls. "I figure another month or 2 of hard work, and it will be ready for someone to live in properly." "Could I see it?" Beatrice asked. "Tomorrow, perhaps? I would like to see what you are building before I make any decisions." "Of course," Jackson said, and the hope in his voice made her chest tighten. I can come by in the morning with the wagon." They talked until the sun set and the barn grew dark around them. Jackson told her about the cattle drives he had been on, about sleeping under the stars and crossing rivers swollen with spring runoff. Beatrice told him about learning to sew from her mother, about the satisfaction of taking a pile of fabric and thread and creating something beautiful and useful. They discovered they both loved reading, though books had been scarce luxuries in both their childhoods. They both preferred coffee to tea, and neither of them cared much for oysters. When Jackson finally rose to leave, promising to return in the morning, Beatrice walked him to the door. The night air was cool and carried the salt smell of the ocean just a few miles to the west. The stars were bright overhead, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled. "Thank you for supper," Jackson said, settling his hat back on his head. "And for not laughing me out of your barn this afternoon." "Thank you for being brave enough to say what you said," Beatrice replied. Not many men would have had the courage. He smiled at her, and even in the darkness she could see the warmth in his expression. "I will see you in the morning, Beatrice." She watched him ride away into the night, and then she went back inside and sat down at her work table. She did not take out the wedding dress again. Instead, she sat in the quiet darkness and thought about what it meant to take a leap of faith, to trust in something that felt right even when it defied all logic and reason. When Jackson arrived the next morning, Beatrice was ready. She had packed a small bag with some food and water, and she wore her most practical dress and sturdy boots. The wagon he drove was old but well-maintained, and the horse pulling it was a sturdy bay mare with kind eyes. The ride to Jackson's property took about an hour, following the main road north out of Ventura, before turning onto a narrow track that wound through rolling hills covered in golden grass. The morning sun was warm on Beatrice's face, and she found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the journey. Jackson pointed out landmarks as they went. A distinctive oak tree that marked the boundary of his property, a bend in the creek where he had seen deer drinking, a rocky outcrop that provided shade on hot afternoons. When they finally reached the cabin, Beatrice understood what Jackson had meant about the bones being good. The structure was small but solidly built, with thick log walls and a stone chimney that rose straight and true. The roof did indeed need work, but Jackson had already replaced several sections of shingles, and stacks of new lumber sat nearby, waiting to be used. The windows were empty of glass, but Jackson had fashioned temporary shutters to keep out the weather. "It is not much yet," Jackson said, as he helped her down from the wagon. "But I can see what it could be." Beatrice walked slowly around the property, taking it all in. The cabin faced east, which meant it would catch the morning sun. The creek Jackson had mentioned ran about 50 yards from the house, clear water bubbling over smooth stones. The barn was small but functional, and she could see where Jackson had already made repairs to the door and the roof. Beyond the immediate area around the cabin, the land rolled away in gentle hills dotted with oak trees. It was beautiful in a spare, honest way that appealed to something deep in Beatrice's soul. "May I see inside?" she asked. Jackson led her through the door, and Beatrice stepped into the single large room that made up the cabin's interior. The floor was rough but level, and she could see where Jackson had replaced several boards. The fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth wide and deep. There were no furnishings yet, but Beatrice could envision how the space might be arranged. A bed in one corner, a table and chairs near the fireplace, shelves along the walls for dishes and supplies. She walked to one of the window openings and looked out at the view of the hills. "There is a root cellar under the floor," Jackson said, pointing to a trap door near the fireplace. "And I am planning to build a lean-to on the back for extra storage. Eventually, I would like to add another room, maybe 2 if we have children." The word children hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility and promise. Beatrice turned to look at him, and she saw the question in his eyes. "It is a good property," she said carefully. "You have chosen well." "But," Jackson prompted gently. "No but," Beatrice said. "I am just trying to wrap my mind around how quickly everything is happening. 2 days ago, I was alone, sewing a wedding dress for an imaginary future. Now, I am standing in a cabin with a man I barely know, planning that future like it is already real." Jackson moved closer, but he kept a respectful distance. "I know it is fast, and I know I am asking you to take a huge risk on someone you just met. But Beatrice, I have never been more certain of anything in my life. The moment I saw you in that barn, something in me just knew. It felt like coming home." Beatrice pressed her hands together, trying to sort through the tangle of emotions in her chest. Fear and hope and excitement and doubt all mixed together until she could barely tell one from another. But underneath it all was that same feeling she had experienced in the barn yesterday, the bone-deep certainty that this was right, that Jackson Zimmerman was the answer to the wish she had sewn into every stitch of that ivory silk dress. "I need you to understand something," she said, meeting his eyes directly. "I am not a woman who does things halfway. If I agree to marry you, I will be a true partner in building this life. I will work alongside you, and I will expect to have a say in the decisions we make. I will not be ornamental or obedient for the sake of appearances. I need to know that you can accept that." "I do not want ornamental or obedient," Jackson said firmly. "I want a partner, Beatrice. I want someone who will challenge me and push me to be better. I want someone with fire and spirit and opinions of her own. I have seen too many marriages where the woman is treated like property or a child, and I have no interest in that kind of union." "And when we disagree," Beatrice pressed, "because we will disagree, Jackson. I have a stubborn streak, and I do not back down easily. Then we will talk it through until we find a solution we can both live with," Jackson said. "I will not always be easy to live with either, Beatrice. I get focused on work and forget to come in for meals. I have a temper, though I have learned to control it, and I can be prideful about asking for help when I need it. But I promise you that I will always listen to you, and I will always respect your right to your own thoughts and feelings." Beatrice walked around the cabin one more time, running her hand along the rough log walls. She thought about the life she had been living in her rented house on the edge of town, the quiet solitude that was both a comfort and a cage. She thought about the wedding dress folded in her trunk, each stitch a prayer for something more. And she thought about the man standing in the center of the room, watching her with patient hope in his dark eyes. "I would like to help you finish the cabin," she said finally. "I am not much use with a hammer, but I can paint and I can sew curtains for the windows. I can help you make this place into a proper home, and while we work together, we can continue getting to know each other. Then, when the cabin is finished, if we both still feel the same way, we can be married." The smile that broke across Jackson's face was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. "That sounds like a perfect plan." They spent the rest of the day at the cabin, Jackson working on repairs, while Beatrice took measurements for curtains and made lists of what would be needed to make the space livable. They talked as they worked, the conversation flowing easily from one topic to another. Jackson told her about his plans for the ranch, about wanting to breed quality horses as well as running cattle. Beatrice told him about her dream of maybe opening a small dress shop in town someday, if she could save enough money. "You could have a workshop here," Jackson suggested, gesturing to an empty corner of the cabin. "Good light from that window, and plenty of space for a proper work table. You could still take commissions from town, and you would not have to pay rent on a separate space." The fact that he not only accepted her desire to continue working, but actively encouraged it, made something warm bloom in Beatrice's chest. She moved closer to him, studying the corner he had indicated. "That would work well," she said. "I could put up shelves for my fabric and supplies, and there would be room for a dress form." They stood side by side, both envisioning the future taking shape in the empty space around them. Jackson's hand brushed against hers, and Beatrice felt a spark of electricity at the contact. She looked up at him, and the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "May I court you properly, Beatrice?" he asked softly. "I know we are doing this all backwards, but I would like to do some things the traditional way. I would like to take you to dinner in town, and maybe to church on Sunday. I would like to bring you flowers and sit with you on your porch in the evenings." "I would like that very much," Beatrice said, and she realized she was smiling. Over the next several weeks, they fell into a rhythm. Jackson would come by Beatrice's house in the mornings, and they would either work at the cabin together, or he would help her with tasks around her property before heading to his own work. In the evenings, he would return for supper, and they would sit on her small porch and talk until the stars came out. On Sundays, they attended church together in Ventura, and Beatrice introduced Jackson to the townspeople she knew. Some of the ladies looked at them with curiosity and a bit of speculation, but most were kind, and several told Beatrice privately that Jackson seemed like a good, solid man. True to his word, Jackson courted her with old-fashioned propriety. He brought her wildflowers picked from the hills around his property, great armfuls of golden poppies and purple lupine that she arranged in jars around her house. He was unfailingly polite and respectful, never pushing for more physical intimacy than she was ready to give, though Beatrice could see the attraction in his eyes when he looked at her. The cabin progressed steadily under their combined efforts. Jackson finished patching the roof and installed proper glass windows that he had ordered from San Francisco. Beatrice sewed curtains from sturdy cotton fabric, simple but cheerful patterns that softened the rough interior. Jackson built a bed frame and a table with matching chairs, and Beatrice stuffed a mattress with fresh straw and wool. Slowly, the bare cabin transformed into a home. One evening in late June, about 6 weeks after their first meeting, Jackson arrived at Beatrice's house with a serious expression on his face. They had planned to go into town for dinner, but instead, he asked if they could sit and talk. "Is something wrong?" Beatrice asked, concern tightening her chest. "No, nothing is wrong," Jackson assured her quickly. "But there is something I need to tell you, something I should have mentioned earlier, but I was afraid it would scare you away." They sat on her porch, and Beatrice waited while Jackson gathered his thoughts. The evening air was warm and still, and somewhere nearby, a mockingbird sang its complex song. "I told you that my parents died when I was 19, Jackson began. "What I did not tell you was that my father died from injuries he sustained trying to stop a group of men from burning down our neighbor's barn. Our neighbors were a black family, former slaves who had bought their own land after the war. Some people in town did not like that, thought they were getting above their station. My father did not hold with that kind of thinking, and when he saw those men gathering one night, he went to stop them. They beat him badly, and he died 3 days later." Beatrice reached out and took Jackson's hand, squeezing it gently. "I am so sorry. My mother died 6 months later," Jackson continued. "The doctor said it was pneumonia, but I think it was really a broken heart. After they were both gone, some of those same men came around, suggested that my sister and I might want to sell the farm and move on. They made it clear that things could get difficult for us if we stayed. So we sold for much less than the property was worth, and I took my sister west, where we could start over." "That must have been terrible," Beatrice said softly. "It taught me something important," Jackson said, turning to look at her directly. "It taught me that a man's character is not determined by the color of his skin, or where he comes from, or how much money he has. It is determined by how he treats people, especially people who cannot fight back. And it taught me that standing up for what is right sometimes costs everything, but it is still worth doing." "Why are you telling me this now?" Beatrice asked, though she thought she might already know the answer. "Because I need you to know who I am," Jackson said. "I need you to know that if we build a life together, I will not tolerate injustice or cruelty, even if speaking against it makes us unpopular. I will not turn away from someone who needs help just because it might cost us business or social standing. If that is going to be a problem for you, I need to know now." Beatrice thought about her own past, about the things she had not yet told Jackson. "My father was a doctor," she said slowly. "Not a wealthy doctor with a fancy practice, but the kind who would treat anyone who came to his door, whether they could pay or not. We were never well off because he would just as soon take a dozen eggs or a sack of flour as payment instead of money. But he was respected, and people came from all over St. Louis to see him because they knew he would help them, regardless of who they were." She paused, remembering. "After he died, I found a box of letters in his desk. They were from patients he had treated, thanking him for his care. There were letters from Irish immigrants and freed slaves and Chinese railroad workers and poor white families. Every kind of person you could imagine, and every single one of them called him a good man." "He sounds like someone I would have liked to know," Jackson said. "I think you would have," Beatrice agreed. "What I am trying to say is that I understand what you were telling me, Jackson, and I respect you for it. My parents raised me to judge people by their character and their actions, not by circumstances of birth. If we marry, you will never have to worry that I will object to you doing the right thing, even when it is hard." Jackson lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "Thank you for understanding." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, hands clasped, watching the light fade from the sky. Beatrice felt something settle into place inside her, a deeper level of trust and connection. This was not just about attraction or convenience or even the romantic notion of love at first sight. This was about shared values and mutual respect, about two people choosing to build something meaningful together. "The cabin is nearly finished," Jackson said eventually. "Another week or two, and it will be ready." "I know," Beatrice said, and her heart beat faster. "Have you changed your mind about marrying me?" Beatrice turned to face him fully, studying the face that had become so dear to her over the past weeks. She had learned the way his eyes crinkled when he was amused, the way his jaw tightened when he was frustrated with a difficult task, the way his whole face softened when he looked at her. She had learned that he sang when he worked, old folk songs his mother had taught him, and that he had a dry sense of humor that caught her by surprise and made her laugh. She had learned that he kept his promises, and that he listened when she talked, and that he made her feel valued in a way no one else ever had. "No," she said firmly. "I have not changed my mind." "Good," Jackson said, and he smiled. "Because I have fallen completely in love with you, Beatrice Nolan, and I cannot imagine my life without you in it." "I love you too," Beatrice whispered, and saying the words out loud made them feel even more real. "I think I have loved you since you walked into my barn and saw me sewing that wedding dress, and did not think I was strange or pathetic for it." "I could never think that," Jackson said. He cupped her face gently in his hand, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "May I kiss you?" Beatrice nodded, and Jackson leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. But she did not want to. She closed the distance between them and pressed her lips to his, and the kiss was sweet and tender and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling. "When should we have the wedding?" Jackson asked. "How long until the cabin is finished?" Beatrice countered. "If I work hard, maybe 10 days. "Then let us plan for 2 weeks from today," Beatrice said. "That will give me time to finish the dress and make any final alterations, and it will give you time to complete the cabin. We can have a simple ceremony at the church with just a few witnesses." 2 weeks, Jackson said, and he kissed her again. "I can wait 2 weeks." Those 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity. Jackson worked from dawn until dusk at the cabin, determined to have everything perfect. He finished the lean, too. He had planned for storage and added a small covered porch across the front of the cabin where they could sit in the evenings. He built a chicken coop behind the house and purchased 6 laying hens from a farmer in town. He cleared more land for the vegetable garden and built a fence around it to keep out the deer and rabbits. Beatrice finished the wedding dress, adding the last of the lace trim and sewing pearl buttons down the back. She also sewed a new shirt for Jackson from fine white cotton and embroidered his initials on the cuff. She packed her belongings, deciding what to take to the cabin and what to leave behind. The landlord had already found a new tenant for her little house, and Beatrice felt only a small pang of nostalgia as she prepared to leave it. This place had served its purpose, but she was ready to move forward into her new life. 3 days before the wedding, Jackson took Beatrice to the cabin for a final inspection. She gasped when she saw what he had done. The whole place gleamed with fresh whitewash, and flower boxes filled with geraniums hung beneath each window. Inside, the furniture he had built was polished and gleaming, and her sewing corner was set up exactly as they had discussed, with shelves for her supplies and a sturdy work table positioned to catch the best light. The bed was made up with a quilt that Jackson's sister had sent as a wedding gift, a beautiful pattern of interlocking rings in shades of blue and white. "Jackson, it is perfect," Beatrice breathed, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. "I wanted it to be ready for you," Jackson said, looking pleased with her reaction. "I wanted you to walk in here as my wife and feel like you were coming home." Beatrice threw her arms around his neck and kissed him soundly. "I already feel that way." The wedding took place on a bright Saturday morning in early July. The church was small but beautiful, with simple wooden pews and windows that let in golden streams of sunlight. Beatrice wore her ivory silk dress, and she had woven wildflowers into her dark hair. Jackson wore his new white shirt and his best trousers, and he looked so handsome that Beatrice felt her breath catch when she saw him waiting for her at the altar. There were about 20 people in attendance. A few of Beatrice's customers from town, the pastor's wife who had been kind to her, Jackson's former employer from the ranch near Sacramento, who had made the trip down to Ventura, and a handful of other folks they had befriended over the past weeks. Jackson's sister had wanted to come, but was expecting a baby soon and could not travel. But she had sent a lovely letter that Jackson read to Beatrice the night before the ceremony. The service was simple and heartfelt. They spoke the traditional vows, promising to love and honor each other through good times and bad. And when the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Jackson kissed Beatrice with such joy that several people in the congregation laughed and applauded. After the ceremony, they held a small reception at the cabin. Neighbors had brought food and cider, and someone produced a fiddle and played cheerful dance tunes. Beatrice danced with Jackson in the clearing in front of their home, his arms strong and steady around her, and she felt happier than she had ever imagined possible. This was what she had dreamed of when she started sewing that wedding dress. Not just a husband, but a true partner. Not just a ceremony, but the beginning of a real life built on love and respect and shared dreams. As the sun began to set and the guests started to depart, Jackson and Beatrice stood on their new porch and waved goodbye. When the last wagon had disappeared down the road, Jackson turned to his wife and smiled. "Alone at last, Mrs. Zimmerman." Beatrice liked the sound of that, though she had decided to keep using Nolan for her sewing business. "What should we do first as a married couple?" "I have an idea," Jackson said, and he swept her up into his arms, making her laugh and clutch at his shoulders. He carried her across the threshold of their cabin and kicked the door shut behind them. He set her down gently, and they stood in the warm glow of the lamplight, looking at each other with a mixture of love and nervousness and anticipation. "I want you to know," Jackson said softly, taking her hands in his, "that we can take this as slowly as you need, tonight, tomorrow, whenever you are ready." But Beatrice was ready. She had been ready since the moment she decided to trust this man with her future. She reached up and began unbuttoning his shirt, her fingers steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "I am ready now," she said. They came together with a tenderness that took Beatrice's breath away. Jackson was patient and gentle, taking time to learn what she liked, making sure she felt safe and cherished. When they finally lay tangled together in their bed, the quilt kicked to the floor and the moonlight streaming through the window, Beatrice felt a sense of completeness she had never experienced before. This was what she had been waiting for. Not just passion, but true intimacy. Not just physical connection, but emotional union. "I love you," Jackson whispered against her hair, his arms wrapped tightly around her. "I love you too," Beatrice replied, and she pressed a kiss to his chest, right over his steadily beating heart. The first months of marriage brought their share of adjustments. They learned each other's rhythms and habits, discovered each other's quirks and annoyances. Jackson did indeed snore, especially when he was overtired, and he tended to track mud into the house if Beatrice did not remind him to remove his boots at the door. Beatrice discovered that she was not a morning person and could be snappish if Jackson tried to engage her in conversation before she had her coffee. She also had a tendency to get so absorbed in her sewing that she would work through mealtimes and have to be reminded to eat. But they also discovered the joys of partnership. They worked together to plant the vegetable garden, and Beatrice felt a deep satisfaction in seeing the neat rows of beans and squash and tomatoes they had cultivated together. Jackson taught her to ride properly, and they spent Sunday afternoons exploring the hills around their property on horseback. Beatrice helped Jackson with the ranch bookkeeping, her neat handwriting recording expenses and income in careful columns, and Jackson helped her deliver finished sewing projects to customers in town. In September, they drove into Ventura for supplies and ran into trouble. A group of men were harassing a Chinese man outside the general store, shouting slurs and threatening him. The man was trying to leave peacefully, but the crowd was blocking his way. Without hesitation, Jackson jumped down from the wagon and pushed through the group. "That is enough," he said firmly, his voice carrying authority. "Let him pass." "This is none of your concern, Zimmerman," one of the men said. His name was Crawford, and he owned a large ranch on the other side of town. "We are just making sure these people know they are not welcome here." "These people are human beings deserving of respect and dignity," Jackson said, his jaw tight with anger. "And it is my concern when I see injustice happening in front of me. Now, step aside." For a tense moment, it looked like things might turn violent. Beatrice climbed down from the wagon and moved to stand beside her husband, her chin lifted defiantly. A few other townspeople began to gather, and Beatrice was relieved to see that not all of them looked sympathetic to Crawford and his friends. "You heard the man," said Mr. Peterson, who owned the hardware store. "Let him pass." The Chinese man took advantage of the distraction to slip away, and Crawford and his group eventually dispersed, though not before Crawford shot Jackson a poisonous look. "You will regret this, Zimmerman." "I doubt that," Jackson said calmly, though Beatrice could see the tension in his shoulders. That night, lying in bed, Beatrice held Jackson close. "You did the right thing today." "I know," Jackson said, But Crawford has influence in this town. He could make things difficult for us. Then we will deal with it together, Beatrice said firmly. That is what marriage is it not? Facing challenges together? Jackson kissed her forehead. Have I mentioned lately how lucky I am to have you? Not in the last few hours, Beatrice teased, and she pulled him down for a proper kiss. True to Crawford's implied threat, things did get more difficult for a while. A few of Beatrice's customers suddenly canceled their orders, offering vague excuses. Jackson had trouble selling some of his cattle because buyers claimed they already had sufficient stock, though he knew that was not true. But there were also people who made a point of supporting them, who went out of their way to do business with the Zimmermans because they approved of what Jackson had done. By the time autumn arrived, painting the hills in shades of gold and brown, the immediate trouble had mostly blown over. Crawford still glared at Jackson whenever they crossed paths, but there were no further incidents. The ranch was doing well, and Beatrice's sewing business was thriving. She had more commissions than she could handle and had to start turning some away. One cool October evening, Beatrice was working on a dress for a customer when she suddenly felt dizzy and nauseous. She made it outside just in time before she was sick. Jackson found her sitting on the porch steps, pale and shaky. "What is wrong?" he asked, immediately concerned. "Should I fetch the doctor?" "No, I do not think that is necessary," Beatrice said slowly, and then a suspicion formed in her mind. She counted backwards quickly, thinking about when she had last had her monthly courses. "Jackson, I think I might be pregnant." The look of absolute joy that spread across his face made Beatrice's eyes fill with tears. "Are you certain?" "Not completely, but the signs are there. We should know for sure in a few more weeks." Jackson sat down beside her and pulled her into his arms, holding her so gently, like she was made of spun glass. "A baby," he whispered. "We are going to have a baby." Over the next weeks, as Beatrice's pregnancy became more certain, they began to prepare. Jackson started building a cradle in the evenings, carefully sanding and finishing the wood until it was smooth as silk. Beatrice sewed tiny clothes and blankets, marveling at how small everything was. They talked for hours about names and about what kind of parents they wanted to be. They both agreed that they would raise their children to be kind and fair-minded, to judge people by their character rather than their circumstances. The pregnancy was not easy. Beatrice was sick frequently during the first few months, and she found that certain smells made her nauseous. Jackson took over most of the cooking, and he brought her dry crackers and weak tea in the mornings before she tried to get out of bed. He was endlessly patient with her mood swings, and he rubbed her swollen feet in the evenings without complaint. As her belly grew, Beatrice had to stop taking commissions that required her to travel into town for fittings. Instead, she focused on simpler projects she could complete from home, and she saved the money carefully for the baby's needs. Jackson was increasingly protective of her as her due date approached, worrying whenever she did anything he deemed too strenuous. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," Beatrice told him one afternoon when he objected to her carrying a basket of laundry. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, Jackson. I am fine." "I know you are strong," Jackson said, taking the basket from her anyway. "But humor me, will you? I just want to take care of you both." Beatrice softened at that and kissed his cheek. "I am lucky to have such an attentive husband." In March of 1884, with daffodils blooming in the garden they had planted together, Beatrice went into labor. It was a long and difficult process, lasting nearly 20 hours. Jackson stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand and wiping the sweat from her face and encouraging her when she was convinced she could not continue. The midwife they had hired, a capable woman named Mrs. Carter, who had delivered half the babies in Ventura, coached Beatrice through each contraction and assured them both that everything was progressing normally. Finally, as the sun rose on a new day, Beatrice gave one last tremendous push, and their son entered the world with a healthy, angry cry. Jackson wept openly when Mrs. Carter placed the baby in his arms, his hands shaking as he counted the tiny fingers and toes. "He is perfect," Jackson said, his voice thick with emotion. "Beatrice, he is absolutely perfect." They named him Joseph, after Jackson's father. He had dark hair like both his parents and his father's dark eyes. Beatrice fell in love instantly with this tiny red-faced creature who had taken up residence in her body and her heart. The first weeks were exhausting, filled with sleepless nights and constant feedings, and learning how to care for this helpless little being who depended on them for everything. But they were also filled with wonder and joy, and a deepening of the bond between Beatrice and Jackson. "Look what we made," Jackson would whisper sometimes when he held Joseph, his expression full of awe. "Look at this miracle we created together." As Joseph grew from a tiny newborn into a chubby, smiling baby, the ranch continued to thrive. Jackson hired a young man named Tom to help with the cattle and horses, which freed up more of his time to spend with his family. Beatrice gradually resumed taking sewing commissions, though she was more selective about what she accepted. She set up a small playpen in her sewing corner, where Joseph could nap or play with his toys while she worked. When Joseph was about 6 months old, Jackson's sister Mary came to visit, bringing her own 2 small children. It was wonderful to see Jackson with his sister, to witness the easy affection between them. Mary was a warm, practical woman who immediately took to Beatrice, and the 2 women spent hours talking while the children played. "I was worried when Jackson wrote to tell me he had met someone and was getting married so quickly," Mary confided one afternoon while they were shelling peas on the porch. "But I can see that he chose well. You make him happy, Beatrice. Happier than I have seen him since our parents died." "He makes me happy too," Beatrice said, watching through the window as Jackson swung Joseph up in the air, making the baby shriek with laughter. "I know it all happened fast, but I cannot imagine my life without him now." "Sometimes the best things happen when we least expect them," Mary said wisely. The years that followed brought their share of challenges and triumphs. There was the drought of 1885 that forced them to sell off some of their cattle, and the hard winter of 1886, when they worried constantly about whether their food supplies would last. There was the joy of watching Joseph learn to walk and talk, and the pride they felt when he showed kindness to the small creatures he encountered, carefully carrying spiders outside instead of squashing them. In the spring of 1887, Beatrice discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, and in December, they welcomed a daughter they named Margaret, called Maggie. She had Beatrice's lighter coloring and Jackson's determined chin, and Joseph was immediately smitten with his baby sister, wanting to help with everything from changing her clothes to singing her lullabies. The ranch continued to grow and prosper. Jackson developed a reputation for breeding quality horses, and people came from as far as Los Angeles to purchase his stock. Beatrice's sewing business evolved into something more specialized. She became known for her beautiful wedding dresses, and women would book her services months in advance. She often thought about that first dress she had sewn for herself, the one she had been working on when Jackson walked into her barn. She kept it carefully stored in her trunk, a reminder of the faith she had taken and the love that had followed. In 1889, when Joseph was 5 and Maggie was 2, they added another room onto the cabin, finally fulfilling Jackson's plan to expand. The children now had their own space, and Beatrice had a dedicated sewing room with large windows that flooded the space with natural light. They also built a larger barn and expanded their vegetable garden. One evening that summer, they sat on their porch watching the children chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. Maggie's delighted giggles rang out across the yard, and Joseph was patiently teaching her how to catch the glowing insects without hurting them. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day?" Beatrice asked, leaning against Jackson's shoulder. "When you found me sewing my wedding dress." "I said I knew a groom who would be honored," Jackson replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Did you imagine all of this?" Beatrice gestured at the house, the children, the life they had built together. "Did you know it would turn out like this?" "I hoped," Jackson said honestly. "But even my hopes did not do justice to the reality. You have given me more than I ever dreamed possible, Beatrice. A home, a family, a life full of love and purpose. Every day I wake up grateful that I had the courage to walk into that barn and speak my heart." "I am grateful you did too," Beatrice said softly. "I was sewing that dress because I refused to give up on the dream of finding real love, even when it seemed impossible. And then you walked through the door and made all of it real." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their children play and listening to the evening sounds of the ranch settling down for the night. The chickens clucked softly in their coop, the horses nickered in the barn, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote sang its lonely song. "Mama, Papa, look!" Joseph called out, running toward them with his hands cupped carefully. "I caught one for Maggie to see." The firefly glowed between his small fingers, pulsing with gentle light. Maggie toddled over, her eyes wide with wonder, and touched the insect carefully with one chubby finger. "Pretty," she said solemnly. "Very pretty," Beatrice agreed. "Now, let it go so it can find its friends." Joseph opened his hands and the firefly lifted into the air, joining the dozens of others dancing above the grass. Maggie clapped her hands and laughed, and Joseph grinned with pride at having pleased his little sister. "Time for bed soon," Jackson called out. "A few more minutes, and then we need to come inside." The children groaned but did not argue, knowing their father was fair but firm. Beatrice watched them run back to their game, and she felt her heart swell with contentment. This was what she had been waiting for all those months she spent sewing her wedding dress. Not just romance or passion, though her marriage with Jackson had plenty of both, but this sense of belonging, of being part of something greater than herself, a family, a home, a love that grew deeper and stronger with each passing year. As the years continued to unfold, the Zimmerman family became an integral part of the Ventura community. Jackson served on the school board and advocated for fair treatment of all children, regardless of their backgrounds. Beatrice donated her sewing services for families who could not afford new clothes, and she taught sewing classes to young women who wanted to learn a trade. They raised their children to be fair-minded and compassionate, and both Joseph and Maggie grew into kind, thoughtful individuals who treated everyone with respect. In 1892, Beatrice was surprised and delighted to discover she was pregnant again at 33. Jackson worried about her more than he had with the previous pregnancies, but Beatrice felt strong and healthy throughout. In the spring of 1893, they welcomed twin boys, whom they named Benjamin and Samuel. Joseph and Maggie were overjoyed to have not one but two new siblings, and they competed to see who could be the most helpful with the babies. The ranch now sprawled across over 100 acres, as they had been able to purchase adjacent land from a neighbor who was retiring. They ran a thriving operation with both cattle and horses, and Jackson employed 3 full-time ranch hands. Beatrice had hired a young woman named Sarah to help with the household tasks and occasionally assist with simple sewing projects, which allowed Beatrice to focus on the more complex work. When the twins were 2 years old, Beatrice received a letter that brought unexpected news. A distant cousin she barely remembered had died in St. Louis and had left Beatrice a small inheritance, $300, and a collection of her mother's jewelry that Beatrice thought had been lost years ago. It was not a fortune, but it was enough for Beatrice to realize another dream. "I want to open a dress shop in town," she told Jackson one evening after they had put the children to bed. "Not a big operation, just a small storefront where women can come for fittings and browse fabric samples. Sarah could manage it most days, and I could go in a few times a week for consultations and fittings." "I think that is a wonderful idea," Jackson said without hesitation. "You have built such a strong reputation, and a shop would make your work more accessible to customers. The inheritance will cover the initial costs, and I can help with any additional expenses." "You do not mind?" Beatrice asked. "It will mean I am in town more, away from the ranch." "Beatrice, I have never wanted to keep you tied to the house," Jackson said firmly. "Your dreams are just as important as mine, and I want to support them however I can. Besides, the children are old enough now that they can help more around the ranch. Joseph is already talking about wanting to work with the horses, and Maggie is showing a real aptitude for gardening." By the fall of 1895, Beatrice opened Nolan's Fine Sewing in a small storefront on Ventura's main street. The shop was modest but beautifully appointed, with bolts of fabric displayed on shelves along the walls and a comfortable fitting area in the back. Word spread quickly, and soon Beatrice was busier than ever. She hired another young woman to help Sarah, and the 3 of them worked together to create beautiful garments for women throughout the county. The shop became more than just a business. It became a gathering place where women could talk freely and support each other. Beatrice made it known that all women were welcome, regardless of their background or circumstances, and she sometimes provided services at reduced rates or even for free for those who were struggling. She remembered her own father's generosity and wanted to honor his memory by helping others when she could. Jackson continued to be her staunchest supporter and her greatest love. They still made time for each other, despite the demands of the ranch and the shop and their 4 growing children. They would take evening walks around the property after the children were in bed, talking about their days and their dreams. On special occasions, they would get someone to watch the children overnight and spend a rare evening alone at the cabin, remembering their early days together and rekindling the romance that had never really faded. "Do you ever regret it?" Jackson asked her one night as they lay together in their bed, the moonlight streaming through the window just like it had on their wedding night 12 years earlier. "Agreeing to marry a stranger who walked into your barn and made a crazy offer?" "Never," Beatrice said without hesitation. She rolled over to face him, tracing the lines around his eyes that had deepened with time and hard work, but somehow made him even more handsome to her. "You were the answer to every prayer I did not know how to speak. You saw me for who I really was and loved me anyway. How could I ever regret that? I am the one who should be grateful," Jackson said, pulling her closer. "You took a chance on me when you had every reason not to. You built this life with me, worked beside me, believed in me even when things were hard. I love you more today than I did the day we married, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today." "That is quite a promise," Beatrice teased, but her eyes were bright with tears. "It is one I intend to keep," Jackson said, and he kissed her with the same passion and tenderness he had shown her on their wedding night. As their children grew into young adults, Beatrice and Jackson took pride in the people they were becoming. Joseph inherited his father's love of horses and his mother's eye for detail, and he showed real talent for training difficult animals with patience and understanding. Maggie surprised everyone by showing an interest in medicine, inspired by stories Beatrice told her about her grandfather. She spent hours reading every medical book she could get her hands on and talked about maybe becoming a nurse someday. The twins, Benjamin and Samuel, were inseparable and got into all manner of mischief together, but they were good-hearted boys who looked after each other and showed the same sense of fairness and justice that their parents had tried to instill. When they were 10 years old, they got into a fight at school defending a boy who was being bullied for his worn-out clothes. Jackson had to go collect them from the schoolmaster, who wanted to punish them for fighting. "I understand your rules about fighting," Jackson told the schoolmaster calmly, "but I will not punish my sons for standing up for someone who could not stand up for himself. If that makes me a bad parent in your eyes, so be it." The schoolmaster was not happy, but he let it go, and the twins became heroes to many of the other students. Beatrice was simultaneously exasperated and proud when she heard the story. "You are encouraging them to be troublemakers," she told Jackson that evening, though she was trying not to smile. "I am encouraging them to be men of character," Jackson corrected. "There is a difference." In 1902, Joseph graduated from school and announced that he wanted to start his own horse training business on a corner of the ranch property. Jackson and Beatrice helped him build a small cabin and a training corral, and they watched with pride as their eldest son began to establish himself. Within a year, Joseph had more clients than he could handle, and people praised his gentle methods and his success with even the most difficult horses. Maggie fulfilled her dream of going into medicine, though not in the way she had originally imagined. After finishing school, she apprenticed with the town doctor and eventually became a skilled midwife and nurse. She had a special gift for working with expectant mothers and delivered dozens of babies throughout the county. Beatrice sometimes went with her to assist, and mother and daughter grew even closer through their shared work. The twins, after finishing school, both decided they wanted to expand the ranch's cattle operation. They were natural businessmen with innovative ideas, and under their management, that side of the business flourished. They negotiated better prices for their stock and found new markets in the growing cities to the north. As Beatrice and Jackson entered their 50s, they gradually began to step back from the day-to-day operations of both the ranch and the dress shop, trusting their children and employees to handle most of the work. They had more time now to simply enjoy each other's company, to take long rides through the hills they had explored together when they were newlyweds, to sit on their porch in the evenings and watch the sun set over the land they had built their life on. "We did well, did we not?" Beatrice said one evening, as they sat together, Jackson's arm around her shoulders and her head resting against his chest. "We did better than well," Jackson said. "We built something that will last beyond us. Look at our children, Beatrice. Look at the good they are doing in the world. That is our real legacy." "I love you, Jackson Zimmerman," Beatrice said, the same words she had spoken thousands of times over the past 20 years, but which still held the same depth of feeling. "And I love you, Beatrice Zimmerman," Jackson replied, more than words could ever express. In 1908, Joseph married a sweet young woman named Emma, who shared his love of horses, and the following year, Beatrice and Jackson became grandparents for the first time when Emma gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Holding her grandson in her arms, Beatrice felt the circle of life completing itself. She thought about her own parents, about how they would have loved to see this moment, to know that their daughter had found happiness and built a good life. "What are you thinking about?" Jackson asked softly, watching her with the baby. "About my father," Beatrice said. "About how I wish he could have met you and known our children and held this little one. He would have been so proud." "I think he knows," Jackson said. "Somehow, I think he knows." Maggie married a few years later, choosing a thoughtful young man who supported her work as a midwife and did not expect her to give up her calling. They built a house in town near the doctor's office where Maggie worked, and they soon had 2 daughters of their own. The twins remained bachelors for longer, too focused on building the ranch business to think much about romance. But eventually, both of them found good women who were willing to take on their boisterous energy and endless schemes. As Beatrice and Jackson moved into their 60s, they spent more and more time simply enjoying the fruits of their life's work. They traveled a bit, taking a train trip to San Francisco that they had talked about for years. They attended every school play and recital their grandchildren performed in. They hosted large family dinners where the house rang with laughter and conversation and the sounds of children playing. The dress shop continued to thrive under Sarah's management, though Beatrice still went in occasionally to work on special projects. She still loved the feel of fabric beneath her fingers, the satisfaction of creating something beautiful and functional. And she still had that first wedding dress, the one she had been sewing when Jackson walked into her barn and changed her life forever. She had shown it to each of her daughters-in-law, telling them the story of how she had sewn it for herself before she even knew her groom existed. "It was an act of faith," she told Emma when Joseph brought her home to meet his parents for the first time. "I believed that love was out there waiting for me, and I was preparing for it even when I had no evidence it would ever arrive. And then one day, it walked through my door." In the spring of 1920, Beatrice and Jackson celebrated their 37th wedding anniversary. Their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a party, and there were now so many of them that they spilled out of the house and onto the lawn. Beatrice looked around at all these people, all these lives that had come from the decision she and Jackson had made on a summer day in 1883, and she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. "Speech!" someone called out, and soon everyone was chanting for Beatrice and Jackson to say something. Jackson stood up, pulling Beatrice to her feet beside him. "37 years ago," he said, his voice still strong despite his age, "I walked into a barn and found a beautiful woman sewing a wedding dress for herself. I fell in love with her in that moment, with her courage and her faith and her refusal to settle for anything less than what she deserved. I told her I knew a groom who would be honored to marry her, and by some miracle, she agreed to take a chance on me." "It was not a miracle," Beatrice interjected, smiling up at him. "It was the smartest decision I ever made." The crowd laughed and applauded, and Jackson squeezed her hand before continuing. "What I want all of you to know is that love is not just a feeling, it is a choice. It is choosing every day to honor and respect and cherish the person you committed yourself to. It is working together through hard times and celebrating together through good times. It is building something bigger than yourself, something that will outlast you. Beatrice and I have been blessed beyond measure, and that blessing is all of you." There were tears and more applause, and then Joseph stood up and proposed a toast. "To Beatrice and Jackson Zimmerman, who taught us what real love looks like. May we all be lucky enough to find even half of what you have built together." "To Beatrice and Jackson," everyone echoed, raising their glasses. That night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet again, Beatrice and Jackson sat on their porch one more time. They were older now, their hair white and their movements slower, but the love between them burned as bright as ever. "Do you remember asking me what I was thinking about when I held our first grandchild?" Beatrice asked. "I remember," Jackson said. "I am thinking the same thing now, but with even more gratitude. I am thinking about how that moment in the barn, when you walked in and saw me with that dress, was the hinge that my whole life swung on. Everything good that came after came from that one moment of courage, yours and mine together. I used to wonder what gave me the nerve to say what I said that day," Jackson mused. "It was so forward, so presumptuous. But something in me just knew, Beatrice. Something told me that you were meant to be mine, and I was meant to be yours." "We were meant for each other," Beatrice agreed. She stood up and held out her hand. Dance with me." "There is no music," Jackson pointed out, but he was already standing and taking her hand. "We do not need music," Beatrice said, and she stepped into his arms. They swayed together in the moonlight, just as they had at their wedding reception 37 years earlier. Their steps were slower now, their bodies not as strong and supple as they once were, but the connection between them was as powerful as ever. They had built a life together from nothing but hope and determination and love, and it had been more than either of them had ever dreamed possible. "Thank you," Jackson whispered against her hair. "For what?" "For being brave enough to sew that wedding dress. For being brave enough to marry me. For every day since then." "The bravery was all yours," Beatrice said. "I was just a woman waiting for her life to begin. You were the one who made it begin." "Then we will call it even," Jackson said, and he kissed her, soft and sweet and full of decades of devotion. They stood there together under the stars, two people who had taken a chance on love and won. And in the years that remained to them, they continued to choose each other every single day, proving that the best love stories are not the ones that start with certainty and perfection, but the ones that start with courage and grow through commitment into something beautiful and lasting and true. Their story became family legend, passed down to children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The tale of how Beatrice sewed her own wedding dress and Jackson walked into her barn and promised her a groom. It became a reminder that sometimes the most important thing is not waiting for life to happen, but preparing for it anyway. Having faith that what you are hoping for will eventually find you. And it became a testament to the power of choosing love every day, of building something lasting and meaningful through respect and partnership, an unwavering commitment to each other's happiness. When Jackson passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1925, at the age of 70, Beatrice held his hand and whispered all the ways he had made her life beautiful. And when Beatrice followed him 2 years later, surrounded by the family they had created together, her last words were about the day a cowboy walked into her barn and saw her sewing a wedding dress, the day her real life had finally begun. The wedding dress itself became a family heirloom, carefully preserved and passed down through generations. Each bride who wore it or simply held it heard the story of Beatrice and Jackson, of courage and faith and love that lasted a lifetime. And in that way, their love story never really ended but continued on, inspiring others to have the courage to dream and the faith to believe those dreams might come true.